this section, we're going to be looking at photosynthesis, which is the process by which plants store energy from sunlight. In the previous chapter, we looked at respiration, which is the harvesting of stored energy. Now, when we harvest energy, it is no different than burning a log. If you burn a log, you're taking a log, exposing it to oxygen, and what do you get released? You get energy released in carbon dioxide. This is exactly what happens when we breathe. When we breathe, we don't burn a log. What we are doing is burning sugar. So when you look at respiration, we take the sugar molecule, we breathe in oxygen, the oxygen combines with the sugar and ADP and phosphate group, and we breathe out carbon dioxide, produce a little water, and ATP is produced as our energy currency. Remember, ATP is one of the most important molecules in any living organism, because ATP is our energy currency, which drives all of the biological processes. So now let's look at photosynthesis. It is the process of capturing energy from sunlight and converting this energy to chemical energy stored into carbohydrates. So when we eat a lump of sugar, we now are going to look at how that energy was stored in that lump of sugar. Now, the formula for photosynthesis is really the reverse of the formula for respiration. In this case, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy from the sunlight is converted to sugar plus oxygen. Again, you see, this is just the opposite of respiration. So let's see how this process works. Now, first of all, the energy is coming in from sunlight. Now, energy coming in from the sunlight comes through a complex electromagnetic waves. The illustration shows you the electromagnetic wave spectrum. To the left, you can see gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet. Going to the right, we jump across the visible light into infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. Now, a plant has the responsibility of capturing as much energy as it can. And what it can do is capture the visible light that we can see. And as you can see, the visible light spectrum is between ultraviolet light and infrared. And we'll look at the rainbow and we see the visible light spectrum. So the object of the plant is to capture as much energy as it can, as much energy waves as it can, by having the right pigments that can capture this light energy. So, in photosynthesis, we have basically two important chemical reactions. The first reaction is the capturing of light, called the light reaction. We capture the energy from sunlight and transfer that energy into ATP, yes, and NADPH, which is an electron carrier. We basically have a bucket full of electrons that eventually will be converted to ATP. Okay, but let's just leave this alone for a second. So again, in the light reaction, we're taking the energy from the sunlight and capturing it into ATP and having ourselves a bucket full of electrons in NADPH. Now, in the Calvin cycle, which is the dark reaction, this energy that we have captured into ATP and all these electrons that we have is used to convert carbon dioxide, which is present in the atmosphere, into sugar, glucose. How and where does all this take place? If you look at a leaf and take a cross-section of the leaf, we can see that a leaf, of course, is an organ, and this organ is made up of lots of tissue, and towards the middle of the leaf, we have cells that are designed to carry out photosynthesis. Now, these cells will have little organelle called chloroplasts. And the chloroplasts, to some extent, are similar to mitochondria in their small little structures that have membrane components where the action takes place. These membrane components are called tachyloids, tachyloid membranes, and within this little package is where the action takes place. So let's now look at the process of photosynthesis. We are looking at a chloroplast, and the chloroplast is where the action takes place. First of all, let's look at our formula. Carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight produces carbohydrates and an important product, of course, oxygen. Without this process, there would be no oxygen present in the air. So the plants are vital not only for producing the nutrients that we will eventually eat, but also producing the oxygen that we breathe. So looking at this formula that you really need to memorize and understand, let's see how this formula translates into the activity that takes place within the membranes of the chloroplast. All right, let's see what happens. From your left, you can see that we're looking at two major reactions, the light reaction and the dark reaction. On the light reaction, you can see sunlight coming in. The sunlight energy is going to be captured in the membranes of the tachyloids. I should say the membranes of the thallicoids. The energy is then going to be transferred into ATP, and electrons will be captured into NADPH. This process, as you can see, also takes into account that water comes in and is broken down into oxygen, which is a byproduct. Now, if we look to the right, we see how the energy that has been captured into ATP and the bucket of electrons that we have is now used to drive this big Calvin cycle. You might think of it as a wheel that's turned and turned through the energy that's given off at ATP and NADPH. The Calvin cycle, what it really does is grabs the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it reduces that carbon dioxide. Basically what it does is it takes the carbon dioxide, builds the molecules of sugar. So carbon dioxide is converted to sugar. So when we look at the formula, carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight produces sugar plus oxygen, we can see how each of these components of the equation is accounted for. We see sunlight, we see water coming in, we see oxygen coming out, we see carbon dioxide being brought in, and finally the important molecule of sugar is produced. So if you look at this overall picture, you can really get an appreciation, okay, for the two distinct processes that take place, the light reaction and the dark reaction, which is the Calvin cycle. So now let's look into a little more detail as to how this process works. In the light reaction, what happens is that within the membranes of the thallicoids, we have these complexes. They're basically photosystems. They're photoreactive cells that can capture sunlight, and when they capture the sunlight, they will actually trigger a response which moves electrons to a high energy level. So what you have done is excited some electrons which are actually provided by the water molecule. So electrons are moved up to high energy level. So what? So that's great. Now we have a bunch of electrons that are all excited, and something's going to happen with them. Now, if we continue to look at this process, the light reaction, the photosystem grabs a bunch of electrons, shoves them up to high energy level, and then these electrons that have lots of energy are bounced down the electron transport chain, very much like you saw in mitochondria. When electrons bounce down the electron transport chain, the energy is released, and guess what's going to happen? ATP, as you can see towards the bottom, is going to be produced. So significant amount of ATP is produced through this bouncing and shuffling of electrons. And this process continues from one photosystem to another photosystem, so you end up with basically lots of ATP and a considerable amount of NADPH, which are electron carriers. Okay, so now, what have we accomplished with the light reaction? We have taken the energy from the sunlight, bounced a bunch of electrons up, and taken the energy out of the electrons and stored them into ATP, energy currency, and NADPH, a package or a bucket full of electrons. Now, what are we going to do next? We're going to take this energy and use it to drive the Calvin cycle. Okay, this actually shows you how the process that we discussed actually works. As you can see, we have a membrane structure, and within the membranes, to your left, you see how energy is coming in, and electrons are shuffled from one protein to another protein to another protein. And during this shuffling process, we are producing lots and lots of electrons stored in NADPH. In addition, not actually shown, ATP is also produced. But this shows you the complexity that's taking place in the sense that electrons get bouncing down these proteins that are present, and eventually they get moved through an electron transport chain, and these electrons are going to be captured in NADPH, and ATP will also be produced. So now we're moving to the dark reaction, the Calvin cycle. In the Calvin cycle, as you can see in this illustration, it's quite complex. Shows you the chemistry that's involved. We're starting off with carbon dioxide that's present in the atmosphere, and the carbon dioxide has to be basically glued together to form glucose. Okay, as you can see, we're starting with carbon dioxide, and we end up with glucose and other derivatives. Now, I don't want you to remember, it's not necessary to remember all the things that are occurring here, but important thing to understand is that the carbon dioxide is moved through a process where you have a series of intermediary molecules, and these molecules eventually end up into a big molecule called glucose. But what drives this, as you can see to the right and to the left, is the energy that we have made in the light reaction, the energy that was stored in ATP. As you can see, you have ATP to the left, you have ATP to the right. Both of these are driving this complex metabolic pathway, and the end result is production of glucose and other derivatives. And also, don't forget, there's a significant amount of electrons that run from NADPH that will also help drive this cycle. So let's try to summarize all of this. Yes, this is complex, but basically what we're doing in the dark reaction is the following. ATP and NADPH. ATP is our energy currency, NADPH is our bucket of electrons. All this is used to drive the Calvin cycle, so that carbon dioxide comes in and sugar comes out, and this, of course, is what we will utilize in the process of respiration. Again, we can look at the overall picture. Carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight gives us carbohydrates plus oxygen. And you can see how this overall picture falls in place. That's it.